This time it's 5 classic British 250s. In the early 1960s, the British government imposed a 250cc maximum capacity regulation on learner riders. This had previously been unrestricted, and while this didn't exactly boost the sales of larger motorcycles, was however a real shot in the arm for the 250 class. So here are 5 classic 250 learner bikes from the 1960s. The Royal Enfield Continental GT. Royal Enfield's Continental GT was introduced in 1964 and was an evolution of the previous Crusader models of unit construction overhead valve 250s. The machine is best known for its sporty styling and also for that slightly troublesome 5-speed gearbox. Sometimes you have to keep your foot on the pedal just to hold the thing down in top gear. Other gearboxes are much better, they do need to be set up very carefully. But when the box was set up correctly, the engine was an absolute peach, with an excellent top speed of around 85 miles an hour, making it probably the fastest British 250 of the era. And to cap it all, Cycle magazine even got 115 to the gallon out of the thing at a steady 30 miles an hour back in '66. Of course, not that many people actually rode it that way. The bike used a 248cc single cylinder overhead valve 4-stroke engine, which unusually for the time, at least for a British bike, used wet sun lubrication. This kicked out a claimed 21 horsepower at 7,500 RPM. Properly set up, these engines should run with a minimum of vibration, and they can even be made all tight too. But it's the styling that Royal Enfield really got right with this machine. From the clip-on handlebars, the dual clocks, the fiberglass tank and those weird cooling discs around the brakes, everything about this bike is spot on aesthetically. And for me it is one of the best looking bikes of any capacity that has ever been built in Britain. So you might wonder, why was the GT not that successful in its time? Well, for one thing, that 5-speed gearbox did little to help the reputation of the company, being somewhat problematic, particularly if set up rather poorly. And the other was of course that the bike was damned expensive. It would cost nigh on the price of a 500cc Triumph. And so just like today, if you wanted one of those bikes in the 1960s, you better have pretty deep pockets. BSA Starfire. In 1958, BSA wanted to replace their aged C12 250 model. They did so with the C15. The C15 was all new and unit construction. Well, I say all new, it was actually roughly based on the Triumph Tiger Cub, which had already been out a few years earlier. Essentially it's a Tiger Cub with the cylinders moved into a vertical position, and of course with a small increase in capacity from 200 to 250 cc's. The C15 was fairly successful, and BSA quickly realised there was great potential for the little motor in use in off-road and on-road competition, particularly trials and motocross, and from this would come the sporty SS80 model. But BSA began to realise that if they wanted to get the full sporting potential out of the little engine, it was going to need a major revamp. So in 1966, they announced the B25, initially called the Barracuda. This produced a claimed 25 horsepower at 8,000 RPM. Now, while the general configuration seemed very little changed, there were quite a lot of changes actually made. There was an all-new square-finned aluminium barrel and totally new crankcases at the bottom end. And inside for the first time was a one-piece forged crankshaft, which had detachable outer flywheel rings. This allowed the engine to be configured for trials or higher revving use such as motocross. But unfortunately for BSA, there was already a Bridgestone motorcycle and an American car for that matter, which both used the Barracuda name. So BSA was left with little alternative but to change the name to Starfire. But the move to the new name would also bring in some improvements too, because the bike would gain an excellent twin-leading shoe front brake, and the move to Tiger 90 style front forks. And of course a big bonus for modern owners is the move to a steel tank, replacing the old fiberglass tank of the Barracuda. Like Royal Enfield, BSA would claim that their little 250 was the fastest British 250 on the market, and with a top speed of just over 80, they weren't too far wrong. BSA would claim that the little overhead valve 250 produced around 25 horsepower, although in reality it's not quite as smooth running as the Royal Enfield's mill. But undoubtedly the best point of the Starfire was its chassis. With its Tiger 90 forks, excellent brakes and rigid motocross-derived frame, this was a great handy little bike. And as I found on a classic track day, the little Starfire can outstop and outturn pretty much any 1960s British machine. Although of course I did rather get swallowed up down the straight. But you can't have it all, can you? The Matchless G2 and AJS Starfire 90. Now, the products of AMC, principally Matchless and AJS, have long had an image problem. They've always been seen as frumpy old man's bikes. But is this deserved? Take for example the Matchless G2, also known as the AJS Starfire 90. This 250, although appears to be unit construction, isn't, because in fact it uses a separate round gearbox. This can be rotated to adjust the primary drive chain, which is a very nice idea, isn't it? And indeed the machine did bristle with nice little ideas. For example, the valve adjustment is very simple on this machine. There's no lock nuts at all. But nevertheless, these pretty little bikes were not held in particularly high regard by the riders of the day. One problem was the company management. They had a very poor relationship with the press of the day and would not release machines out for testing. And not surprisingly, this did adversely affect the views of the machine from the press and the associates around them. And the other problem is that the styling of the machine, whilst it looks very nice to us today, to people in the 1960s just looks rather old-fashioned. That is the styling of the engine and the machine in general both. And this is a great shame because riders missed out on what was actually a very nice machine, particularly in its sporty CSR variants. And indeed in this form it could top just over 80 miles an hour, pretty much on par with the rest of the 250 opposition of the day. And even in this higher state of tune, the engine remained flexible and well mannered throughout its rev range. Both chassis and brakes were praised in the 66 motorcycle test, and overall the machine was rated very highly. With one caveat, it's quite a large machine, so shorter riders beware. But if you're a 6-footer, this was a great bike for you. And in the end, this is a machine that should have been more successful in its time and should be better known and more appreciated today. But the attitude of AMC towards the press and the general slightly frumpiness of the design means that it was not successful. And by 1966, it was pretty much all over for AMC. Like so many AMC machines, the G2 is an excellent first classic, easy to work on, well designed and with a good reputation for reliability. And yet in the classic world the machines are not held in high regard, so values are pretty good for both the 250 and the 350. The Ariel Leader and Arrow. The Ariel Arrow and its touring Ariel Leader stablemate were the last machines to actually reach production, designed by one of Britain's greatest ever motorcycle designers, Valentine Page. Val had begun his career developing racing machines at the Brooklyn circuit. He later joined Ariel and completely revamped their range in the 1930s before moving on to join Triumph and designing their first parallel twin, the 6-1, a few years before the Speed Twin, and of course his best known work, the BSA Gold Star, during a spell he also spent at BSA, before moving back again to Ariel. The design of the Leader and its two-stroke parallel twin engine was in some ways influenced by designs often used in Germany at the time, although the Ariel Leader is quite different from all of those bikes, so it's influenced by and not a copy of. The Leader came first, and this touring model was fitted as standard with a fairing, as well as an option of built-in panniers with indicators included too. It is often said that the Leader was a sales failure. This is not quite true, it just didn't quite sell in the numbers that Ariel had hoped for. It was profitable. But Page realised quite early on that by removing the fairing and the panniers, he could create a more sporty looking model with a bit of a restyle. But even with the fairings off, this was a fairly unusual looking machine, and the styling did not appeal to everybody. But for those who did, they found that the Ariel was a surprisingly capable on-road machine. Now you will find occasionally that the machine will be included in a list of 10 worst bikes ever produced, and the C90 amazingly finds its way onto there also. I think these lists are compiled by people who have no idea what they're talking about. This is a very good machine. The handling was excellent, despite what many people have said, and ground clearance was pretty good too. And as an all-round package, the Ariel was an excellent road-going machine of the 1960s, and the two-stroke motor could wang the thing up to just over 80, so it was pretty much on the money compared to the rest of the sporty 250s of the period. The chassis, however, was rather better, and most 250s of the period will not hang with an Ariel Leader for the corners. The only downside of the chassis is those leading link forks. They do provide an excellent ride, but they do mean that the brakes aren't particularly good, especially at the front. And if anything, it's those front brakes that really let the bike down. So why do we see hate poured over this machine on the internet? Well, it's largely because of its unusual styling. Ditto, of course, the Honda Cub, which is the best-selling vehicle of all time. So I'd have to say the Arrow is in pretty darn good company in the end. Now, if you're into classic two-strokes, the Ariel makes an excellent choice. Prices are fairly reasonable, except for possibly the Golden Arrow Sports model. This is highly collectible and very rare. So in conclusion, don't believe everything you read on the internet, especially about the Ariel Arrow. If you get a chance, try one yourself, because I've got a feeling you'll be very pleasantly surprised. Villiers powered 250 twins. Villiers 2T and later 4T two-stroke parallel twins were used in a whole range of motorcycles, from Norman, James, Panther, Francis Barnett, Greaves, DMW and many others. So unusually our last selection isn't actually about any single machine, but instead in honour of all those companies that chose Villiers as their choice of power unit. The 249cc Villiers 2T parallel twin two-stroke engine first appeared in 1956, and neighbours DMW were the first company to so use the engine. The engine incorporated piston port induction and employed a carburettor of Villiers' own design. Peak power was said to be around 14.5 horsepower, which was transmitted via a primary drive chain to a 4-speed gearbox. Many, particularly fans of later Japanese two-strokes, completely dismissed these Villiers two-strokes as archaic and outdated, but that really is doing these engines something of a disservice. They make the power in a very different way from a later Japanese bike, and were designed to do so. They're smoother and less vibratory than any Japanese two-stroke, and produce their power in a much more linear, much more torquey way. So compared to say a Kawasaki, the engine is much more user-friendly and much more civilised. Of course, for some that just equates to plain boring. But the fact is that of their time these engines offered reasonable performance in relation to most of the big name opposition. In 1963, minicar maker Bond approached Villiers asking for a more torquey version of the engine for use in one of their cars. Villiers would redesign the 2T to produce the 4T. In car form this would make the same 14.5 horsepower but would offer better bottom end and middle range punch. Very useful for a car of course. But the 4T was quite different at the top end to the earlier engines. There is of course the obvious squared off, more modern looking barrels, but these barrels also contain more numerous and shallower transfer ports. In motorcycle installation, Villiers would make use of reverse cone exhausts for the first time, and this resonance tuned device would help boost power from 14.5 to 17 horsepower, although the use of these exhausts also meant that the bottom end punch of the engine was lost in motorcycle trim. A fact often lamented by commuters of the period. But the advantage of those extra few horses was that machines fitted with the engine were just about capable of hitting 70 miles an hour. So whilst not rip-roaringly fast, they were at least capable of performing on a similar level to a modern learner machine. Do you have any suggestions for crazy videos that we can make groups of 5 out of? Do you own one of the machines featured in the video and how do you find it? Why not drop us a line and let us know below. Hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe, and of course, thank you very much for watching.